In the mist-shrouded hills of southern Missouri, where the Ozark Mountains keep their secrets buried beneath layers of limestone and time, there occurred an event in the autumn of 1895 that would forever change how the mountain folk spoke of hospitality and trust. Three sisters named Holloway had extended an invitation that seemed like Christian kindness itself, offering to host a harvest supper for their scattered neighbors in a gesture of community spirit that should have brought warmth to the approaching winter. But when the evening mist finally lifted from Miller's Hollow the following morning, it revealed a truth so disturbing that those who witnessed it would carry the burden of silence to their graves, and the very mention of that supper would become a whispered legend that parents would use to warn their children about the dangers that can hide behind the most innocent of smiles. The Holloway sisters had arrived in Miller's Hollow during the summer of 1894, purchasing the old Henderson farmstead that had sat empty for nearly 3 years after its previous owners had departed under circumstances that the locals preferred not to discuss. The property sat in a natural depression between two ridges, creating a pocket of perpetual dampness where the morning fog lingered well into the afternoon and where even the brightest summer days seemed muted by an atmosphere of melancholy that no amount of sunshine could dispel. Prudence Holloway, the eldest of the three sisters, appeared to be a woman in her early 40s with prematurely grey hair that she wore in a severe bun that seemed to pull the very warmth from her angular features. Her pale blue eyes held an intensity that made even the most confident men in the community feel as if they were being evaluated for purposes they could not fathom, and her smile, when it appeared, carried an quality that suggested it was being carefully measured and dispensed, according to some internal calculation. Charity Holloway, the middle sister, possessed a beauty that was both striking and somehow unsettling to those who encountered her. Her dark hair and olive complexion suggested Mediterranean ancestry that seemed out of place in the Missouri hills, while her movements carried a grace that appeared almost choreographed, as if every gesture had been practiced and perfected for maximum effect. When she spoke, her voice held musical qualities that seemed to resonate at frequencies that made listeners feel simultaneously comforted and uneasy. Hope Holloway, the youngest sister, appeared to be barely 18 years old, though there was something in her green eyes that suggested she had witnessed experiences far beyond her apparent years. She rarely spoke in the presence of strangers, but when she did, her words carried a weight and wisdom that seemed inappropriate for someone of her supposed age. Her laughter, when it occurred, held undertones that made those who heard it feel as if they were missing some private joke that they were not meant to understand. The sisters had introduced themselves to the community as recent widows from St. Louis who had come to the mountains seeking peace and a simpler way of life, after losing their husbands in various industrial accidents that had left them financially comfortable, but emotionally devastated. Their story was plausible enough for the mountain folk, who understood that grief could drive people to seek solitude in places where the weight of memories might be lightened by distance and isolation. The farmstead that the sisters had purchased came with nearly 200 acres of mixed timber and pasture land, along with a large main house that had been built in the 1860s by the original homesteader. The house itself was an impressive structure for the region, featuring 2 full stories, with a wraparound porch and architectural details that suggested the original owner had possessed both wealth and aspirations that exceeded the typical frontier farmer. The previous owners, the Henderson family, had lived on the property for nearly 20 years before their sudden departure in 1891. Local residents remembered them as a prosperous and well-regarded family who had seemed to have every reason to remain in the community, making their abrupt abandonment of the property all the more mysterious and troubling to their neighbors. The circumstances surrounding the Henderson family's departure had never been fully explained to the satisfaction of the community. Various stories circulated about family disputes, financial troubles, or health concerns that might have motivated their decision to leave, but none of these explanations seemed adequate to account for the completeness of their departure or their apparent unwillingness to maintain any contact with former friends and neighbors. What was known for certain was that the Henderson family had left behind most of their possessions, including furniture, household goods, and even personal items that suggested they had departed with great haste and little planning. The house had been discovered by a neighbor who had become concerned when no smoke was seen from the chimney for several consecutive days during a cold spell in November 1891. The discovery of the abandoned house had revealed that the Hendersons had vanished sometime during the night, leaving behind unmade beds, partially prepared meals, and other evidence that their departure had been sudden and unplanned. Most disturbing to the investigators was the complete absence of any note or explanation that might have provided insight into their reasons for leaving or their intended destination. The subsequent investigation into the Henderson family's disappearance had been conducted by the county sheriff, but had failed to produce any credible leads or explanations for their vanishing. The family's bank accounts remained untouched. Their relatives in other states had received no communication from them, and inquiries to authorities in surrounding counties and states had produced no reports of their arrival elsewhere. The mystery of the Henderson family's fate had gradually faded from active discussion in the community, though it remained a source of unease and speculation among the local residents. The fact that their property had remained unsold for 3 years before the Holloway sisters' arrival had only added to the sense of foreboding that surrounded the farmstead and contributed to the reluctance of potential buyers to consider purchasing the property. The arrival of the Holloway sisters in the summer of 1894 had initially been welcomed by the community as a positive development that might help dispel the lingering atmosphere of mystery and concern that had surrounded the property since the Henderson disappearance. The sisters appeared to be respectable women who possessed the resources and determination necessary to restore the farmstead to productive use. During their first year in Miller's Hollow, the sisters had maintained cordial but somewhat distant relationships with their neighbors, participating in community activities when invited, but rarely initiating social contact themselves. Their behavior was attributed to grief and the natural caution of newcomers who were still adjusting to rural life after their urban upbringing. The sisters had proven to be capable farmers and homemakers, successfully maintaining their property and even implementing improvements that suggested both practical knowledge and financial resources. Their gardens flourished despite the challenging growing conditions in the hollow, and their livestock appeared to thrive under their care in ways that exceeded what their neighbors had been able to achieve on similar land. The success of the sisters' farming operations had gradually earned them respect within the community, though some residents had begun to comment on certain unusual aspects of their methods and results. Their crops seemed to grow faster and produce higher yields than should have been possible, given the soil and climate conditions, while their animals displayed levels of health and productivity that exceeded normal expectations. Some of the more observant neighbors had noticed that the sisters seemed to follow agricultural practices that differed from traditional methods, though they were reluctant to discuss their techniques when questioned about their remarkable success. Their reticence on this subject was generally attributed to competitive instincts or trade secrets that they preferred to keep private. The invitation to the harvest supper had come in early October 1895, delivered personally by Hope Holloway to each of the neighboring families within a 5-mile radius of their farmstead. The youngest sister had made these visits during the early morning hours, appearing at kitchen doors just as families were beginning their daily routines, and extending the invitation with a charm and sincerity that made refusal seem churlish and ungrateful. The invitation itself was for a harvest celebration to be held at the Holloway farmstead on the evening of October 31st, 1895, with the sisters promising to provide all food and drink for what they described as a gesture of gratitude for the community's acceptance and assistance during their first year in Miller's Hollow. The date chosen for the celebration coincided with All Hallows' Eve, a fact that some residents found mildly concerning given the various folk beliefs and superstitions associated with that particular night. Hope's personal delivery of the invitations had been accompanied by small gifts for each family, including preserves, baked goods, and other tokens of appreciation that demonstrated both the sisters' domestic skills and their apparent prosperity. These gifts were received with genuine appreciation by the recipients, who found them to be of exceptional quality and flavor that exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The response to the invitation had been overwhelmingly positive, with virtually every family in the area accepting the sisters' hospitality and expressing genuine appreciation for their generosity and community spirit. The prospect of a social gathering that would bring together neighbors who rarely had opportunities for extensive interaction was welcomed as a highlight of the autumn season. As the date of the supper approached, the sisters had been observed making extensive preparations that suggested they were planning an event of considerable scope and sophistication. Deliveries of supplies and provisions had arrived at the farmstead with unusual frequency, though the contents of these shipments were not visible to casual observers, and the sisters had not discussed the details of their preparations with their neighbors. The evening of October 31st, 1895, had begun with weather that seemed perfectly suited for a harvest celebration, featuring clear skies, mild temperatures, and a full moon that provided ample natural illumination for travel along the rough mountain roads that connected the scattered homesteads. The families invited to the supper had made their way to the Holloway farmstead during the early evening hours, bringing children and elderly relatives to participate in what promised to be a memorable community gathering. The Holloway farmstead had been transformed for the occasion, with lanterns and decorative elements that created an atmosphere of festivity and welcome that impressed the arriving guests with its elegance and attention to detail. The main house had been opened completely to accommodate the large number of visitors, with rooms that had rarely been seen by outsiders revealed to contain furnishings and decorations that spoke of wealth and sophisticated taste. The three sisters had greeted their guests with warmth and hospitality that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations, making each family feel specially welcomed and appreciated for their presence at the celebration. Their coordination in managing the logistics of such a large gathering demonstrated organizational skills that suggested considerable experience in entertaining, though they had given no previous indication of possessing such capabilities. The meal that had been prepared for the celebration was remarkable in both quantity and quality, featuring dishes and delicacies that seemed impossible to have obtained or prepared in such a remote location. The variety of foods available exceeded anything that the guests had previously encountered, including exotic ingredients and sophisticated preparations that suggested access to resources far beyond what should have been available in rural Missouri. The presentation of the meal had been orchestrated with theatrical precision, with each course appearing at perfectly timed intervals and served with accompaniments that complemented and enhanced the flavors in ways that demonstrated culinary expertise of the highest order. The sisters had managed the service with seamless coordination that made the complex logistics of feeding so many people appear effortless. The guests had found themselves enjoying not only the exceptional food and drink, but also conversation and entertainment that seemed to bring out the best qualities in everyone present. Neighbors who rarely spoke to each other were engaged in animated discussions. Children who were typically shy and reserved were participating enthusiastically in games and activities, and elderly residents were sharing stories and memories with energy and enthusiasm that exceeded their normal capabilities. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere of the gathering had taken on qualities that seemed almost magical in their ability to create connections and experiences that transcended the ordinary social interactions typical of such community events. The sisters had moved among their guests with grace and attention that made each person feel valued and appreciated, while somehow maintaining perfect coordination in managing all aspects of the celebration. The children present at the gathering had been particularly affected by the evening's festivities, displaying levels of excitement and engagement that delighted their parents, while also creating a sense of unease among some of the more observant adults. The youngsters seemed to be experiencing the celebration with an intensity that bordered on euphoria, participating in activities and games with energy that exceeded their normal behavior patterns. Dr. Jeremiah Whitmore, the nearest physician to Miller's Hollow, had been among the guests at the harvest supper and had found himself observing the evening's events with professional interest as well as personal enjoyment. His medical training had made him sensitive to changes in behavior and physical condition that might escape the notice of other attendees, and he had begun to detect subtle anomalies in the responses of both adults and children to the sisters' hospitality. The physician's observations had initially focused on the remarkable effects that the evening seemed to be having on the health and energy levels of guests who typically suffered from various chronic ailments and physical limitations. Elderly residents who normally moved with difficulty were walking with sprightliness and energy, while individuals who struggled with depression or anxiety appeared to be experiencing levels of joy and social confidence that exceeded their normal emotional range. Dr. Whitmore had found these improvements in his neighbors' conditions to be initially gratifying, though he had begun to suspect that the changes might be attributable to factors beyond the simple enjoyment of good food and pleasant company. His attempts to identify specific causes for the observed improvements had been frustrated by the complexity of the social environment and his own participation in the festivities. As the evening had reached its climax, the sisters had announced a special presentation that they described as their gift to the community in appreciation for the warm welcome they had received during their first year in Miller's Hollow. This presentation had involved the three sisters performing what appeared to be a combination of music, storytelling, and dramatic presentation that captured the complete attention of every guest present. The performance had begun with Charity Holloway singing, in a voice that seemed to possess qualities that transcended normal human vocal capabilities, producing harmonics and resonances that affected listeners at levels deeper than conscious awareness. Her songs had been accompanied by Hope playing a musical instrument that none of the guests could identify, though its tones had created emotional responses that brought many listeners to tears of joy and wonder. Prudence Holloway had served as narrator for the presentation, telling stories that seemed to weave together the personal histories and family traditions of the assembled guests in ways that created a sense of shared identity and collective purpose that none of them had previously experienced. Her words had seemed to touch on memories and emotions that the listeners had not realized they possessed, creating connections between past and present that transformed their understanding of their own lives and relationships. The combined effect of the sisters' presentation had been to create a state of collective consciousness among the assembled guests that seemed to transcend individual identity and awareness. The boundaries between separate personalities had seemed to dissolve, creating a shared experience that encompassed all present in a unity of purpose and emotion that exceeded anything they had previously imagined possible. During this peak moment of the evening's festivities, the guests had found themselves participating in activities and experiences that they would later struggle to remember clearly or describe accurately. The shared consciousness that had been created through the sisters' presentation had seemed to operate according to principles that exceeded normal human psychological and social capabilities. The morning after the harvest supper had brought confusion and disorientation for many of the guests, who had awakened in their own beds with only fragmentary memories of how they had returned home or what had transpired during the final hours of the celebration. Most retained clear recollections of the early portions of the evening, but the events following the sisters' presentation remained vague and dreamlike in their memories. Dr. Whitmore had been among those who experienced significant memory gaps regarding the conclusion of the evening's events, though his medical training had enabled him to recognize that his condition was shared by other attendees. His attempts to reconstruct the events through conversations with other guests had revealed that virtually everyone present had experienced similar memory difficulties regarding the final portion of the celebration. The physician's investigation into the collective memory loss had initially focused on the possibility that the food or drink served at the supper might have contained substances that could affect consciousness and memory formation. However, his analysis of the symptoms reported by various guests had revealed patterns that did not correspond to any known psychoactive substances or medical conditions. The investigation had been complicated by the reluctance of many community members to discuss their experiences at the harvest supper, with some expressing embarrassment about their memory difficulties, while others seemed to fear that detailed discussion might somehow recreate the disorienting effects they had experienced. This reluctance had made it difficult to gather comprehensive information about the events and their effects. As days passed following the harvest supper, additional disturbing developments had begun to emerge that suggested the evening's events had created lasting effects on some of the attendees. Several children who had been present at the celebration had begun displaying behavioral changes that concerned their parents, including alterations in sleep patterns, appetite, and social interactions that seemed to reflect ongoing influences from their experience at the sisters' farmstead. The most troubling changes had been observed in the youngest children who had attended the supper, who had begun speaking of dreams and experiences that seemed to involve continued contact with the Holloway sisters, despite being physically separated from them. These reports had initially been dismissed as normal childhood imagination, but their consistency and detail had gradually raised concerns among parents and community leaders. Some of the affected children had begun displaying knowledge and abilities that exceeded their previous capabilities, including enhanced memory, improved problem-solving skills, and what appeared to be intuitive understanding of concepts that should have been beyond their developmental level. While these improvements might have been viewed as beneficial under other circumstances, their connection to the mysterious events at the harvest supper had made them sources of anxiety rather than celebration. The adult attendees had also begun reporting ongoing effects from their experience at the sisters' celebration, though these were generally more subtle and difficult to identify than the changes observed in the children. Many reported improvements in health conditions that had troubled them for years, while others described enhanced energy levels and emotional stability that exceeded their normal experience. However, along with these apparently beneficial effects, some adults had begun experiencing unusual dreams, altered sleep patterns, and what could only be described as intrusive thoughts that seemed to originate from sources outside their own consciousness. These experiences had created a growing sense of unease within the community about the true nature of the sisters' hospitality and its lasting consequences. Dr. Whitmore's medical investigation into these ongoing effects had revealed physiological changes in some of the supper attendees that could not be explained through conventional medical understanding. Blood chemistry analyses had shown alterations in hormone levels and neurotransmitter activity that suggested fundamental changes in biological functioning, while neurological examinations had revealed modifications in brain activity patterns that exceeded anything documented in medical literature. The physician's findings had suggested that the attendees had been exposed to influences that operated at biological and psychological levels simultaneously, creating coordinated changes that affected both physical health and mental functioning in ways that appeared to be beneficial, but also potentially irreversible. The mechanisms responsible for these changes remained completely unknown to contemporary medical science. The investigation had also revealed that the effects of the harvest supper were not distributed equally among all attendees, with some individuals showing dramatic changes while others appeared to be largely unaffected. The factors that determined susceptibility to these influences remained unclear, though Dr. Whitmore had begun to suspect that psychological and spiritual characteristics might play important roles in determining individual responses. As winter had approached in 1895, the community had gradually adapted to living with the ongoing mysteries and uncertainties created by the harvest supper, though the underlying tensions and concerns had continued to affect social relationships and community dynamics. The knowledge that some residents had been fundamentally altered by their experience at the sisters' farmstead had created divisions and suspicions that undermined the social cohesion that had previously characterized Miller's Hollow. The Holloway sisters themselves had maintained their presence in the community throughout the winter months, continuing to operate their farmstead and participate in local activities as if nothing unusual had occurred. Their behavior had remained cordial, but somewhat distant, offering no explanations or acknowledgments regarding the extraordinary events that had taken place at their harvest celebration. The sisters' apparent normalcy in the aftermath of the supper had been both reassuring and troubling to their neighbors, who had been uncertain whether to view them as benefactors who had provided beneficial experiences or as potentially dangerous individuals whose capabilities exceeded safe boundaries. This ambiguity had made it difficult for the community to develop appropriate responses to their continued presence. The spring of 1896 had brought new developments that had further complicated the community's relationship with the Holloway sisters, as additional families in the area had begun reporting experiences that suggested ongoing influence from their encounter with the sisters at the harvest supper. These reports had included enhanced agricultural success, improved health outcomes, and various forms of what could only be described as good fortune that exceeded normal statistical expectations. However, these apparently beneficial developments had been accompanied by a growing sense that the affected families were being drawn into some form of dependence or obligation to the sisters that they did not fully understand. The improvements in their circumstances had seemed to come with subtle costs or expectations that created ongoing anxiety about the true nature of their relationship with their mysterious neighbors. The investigation into these ongoing developments had revealed that the effects of the Harvest Supper were continuing to evolve and expand rather than diminishing over time, suggesting that the sisters had initiated processes that were designed to create lasting changes in the community rather than temporary enhancements. The implications of this discovery had been profoundly disturbing for those who recognized the potential consequences of such systematic influence. Dr. Whitmore's research had led him to conclude that the Holloway sisters possessed knowledge and capabilities that enabled them to influence human consciousness and biological functioning in ways that exceeded anything documented in medical or scientific literature. Their methods appeared to combine advanced understanding of psychology, biology, and what could only be described as supernatural forces to achieve results that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and potential. The physician's attempts to understand the theoretical basis for the sisters' capabilities had led him into areas of investigation that challenged his scientific training and forced him to consider possibilities that conventional education had taught him to dismiss as impossible. His findings had suggested that the sisters represented examples of human development that transcended normal limitations through methods that were unknown to mainstream academic institutions. The broader implications of the Holloway sisters' presence in Miller's Hollow had gradually become apparent as their influence on the community had continued to expand and intensify over the months following the Harvest Supper. The changes they had initiated appeared to be part of a systematic program designed to transform the social, psychological, and possibly biological characteristics of the entire population in ways that served purposes that remained unknown to the affected individuals. The realization that their community was being systematically altered by forces they could not understand or control had created a crisis of identity and autonomy that had divided the residents into factions with different perspectives on how to respond to their situation. Some had embraced the changes as beneficial improvements that enhanced their quality of life, while others had viewed them as unwanted intrusions that threatened their individual freedom and authentic identity. The conflict between these perspectives had created social tensions that had undermined community relationships and institutions, making it difficult for the residents to coordinate effective responses to their situation. The sisters' influence had seemed to operate most effectively when it encountered divided and conflicted populations, suggesting that social discord might actually serve their purposes rather than hindering their activities. As the second anniversary of the sisters' arrival in Miller's Hollow had approached in the summer of 1896, the community had found itself fundamentally transformed by their presence and influence. The changes that had begun with the Harvest Supper had evolved into comprehensive alterations in social structure, economic relationships, and individual consciousness that had created a new form of community organization that operated according to principles that none of the residents fully understood. The investigation into these transformations had revealed that the Holloway sisters were not simply individuals with unusual capabilities, but were representatives of a form of human development that transcended conventional understanding of personal identity and social organization. Their presence in Miller's Hollow appeared to be part of a larger pattern of activity that extended beyond the local community to encompass broader regions and possibly other locations entirely. The modern analysis of the Holloway sisters case has benefited from advances in psychology, neuroscience, and social psychology that have provided theoretical frameworks for understanding phenomena that were incomprehensible to 19th-century investigators. Contemporary researchers have applied modern analytical techniques to the limited documentation that survived from the original events, revealing patterns and characteristics that support various theories about the nature of consciousness manipulation and social influence. The psychological analysis has revealed that the sisters' methods were consistent with advanced techniques of persuasion, conditioning, and consciousness alteration that combined elements from various therapeutic and educational approaches with what appeared to be naturally occurring capabilities that exceeded normal human potential. Their success in creating lasting changes in their subjects suggested understanding of psychological principles that were far in advance of contemporary knowledge. The sociological investigation has revealed that the transformation of Miller's Hollow followed patterns that were consistent with various theories of social change and community development, though the mechanisms involved appeared to operate at levels of sophistication that exceeded anything documented in academic literature. The sisters had apparently possessed understanding of social dynamics that enabled them to guide community evolution in directions that served their specific objectives. The contemporary understanding of the case has been limited by the destruction or disappearance of much of the original documentation, including medical records, personal accounts, and official reports that might have provided more detailed information about the events and their consequences. The limited surviving evidence suggests that the case was deliberately suppressed or concealed by authorities who were concerned about its implications for social stability and public safety. The legacy of the Holloway sisters and their harvest supper continues to influence folklore and legend throughout the Missouri Ozarks, though the original events have been transformed through generations of retelling into stories that emphasize supernatural elements while obscuring the psychological and social aspects that were central to the original occurrences. The case remains one of the most intriguing examples of unexplained influence on human consciousness and community development in American history. In the eternal mystery of human consciousness and social transformation, where the boundaries between individual identity and collective purpose remain as permeable as morning mist in mountain hollows, the story of the Holloway sisters serves as a haunting reminder that human potential may encompass capabilities that exceed our comfortable assumptions about the nature of reality and the limits of personal influence, leaving us to wonder whether the experiences we consider most fundamental to our identity might be more malleable than we dare imagine, and whether forces beyond our understanding continue to shape our communities and consciousness in ways that we perceive as natural development, but which might actually represent guided evolution toward destinations that we have not chosen and purposes that we cannot comprehend. The aftermath of the harvest supper had extended far beyond the immediate effects experienced by the attendees, creating ripples of change that spread throughout the broader region as news of the mysterious events began to attract attention from researchers, investigators, and curiosity seekers from distant locations. The original community of Miller's Hollow found itself at the center of an expanding circle of interest that brought both opportunities and dangers as outside forces sought to understand or exploit the phenomena associated with the Holloway sisters. Professor Marcus Blackwood of the University of Missouri had been among the first outside researchers to arrive in Miller's Hollow, drawn by reports of unusual psychological and physiological effects that challenged conventional understanding of human consciousness and biological adaptation. His academic background in psychology and emerging theories of unconscious mental processes had prepared him to approach the sisters' activities from scientific rather than purely supernatural perspectives. The professor's investigation had employed systematic documentation methods that were advanced for the 1890s, including detailed interviews with affected individuals, physiological measurements, and psychological assessments designed to quantify the changes that had occurred following the harvest supper. His findings had provided the first scientific validation of claims that had previously been dismissed as folklore or collective delusion. Professor Blackwood's research had revealed that the effects of the sisters' influence operated according to principles that were consistent with emerging theories about suggestion, hypnosis, and unconscious mental programming, though the sophistication and permanence of the changes exceeded anything that contemporary psychological science considered achievable through known techniques. The sisters appeared to possess understanding of consciousness manipulation that was decades ahead of academic knowledge. The psychological profiles developed through Professor Blackwood's research had revealed that the individuals most strongly affected by the harvest supper shared certain personality characteristics that seemed to make them particularly susceptible to consciousness alteration. These characteristics included high levels of creativity and imagination, strong emotional sensitivity, and what the professor described as permeable ego boundaries that enabled external influences to affect their core psychological structures. The professor's investigation had also revealed that the effects of the sisters' influence were not random or chaotic, but followed systematic patterns that suggested deliberate programming designed to achieve specific objectives. The changes in consciousness and behavior appeared to be coordinated toward creating a community that would be more receptive to continued influence and more capable of serving whatever purposes the sisters had in mind for their subjects. The documentation of these systematic patterns had provided evidence that the Holloway sisters were not simply individuals with unusual natural abilities, but were representatives of a sophisticated understanding of consciousness manipulation that had been developed through extensive research and experimentation. Their methods suggested access to knowledge that transcended anything available through conventional education or training. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, a pioneering researcher in what would later be recognized as parapsychology, had traveled to Miller's Hollow in 1897 as part of her investigation into reports of extraordinary phenomena throughout rural America. Her background in both medical practice and psychical research had provided her with unique qualifications for understanding the complex intersection of physical and mental effects that characterized the sisters' influence. Dr. Whitfield's research methodology had involved controlled experiments designed to test specific aspects of the phenomena associated with the sisters, while also documenting the physiological and psychological mechanisms through which their influence operated. Her scientific approach had provided rigorous validation of effects that had previously been considered impossible or fraudulent by mainstream medical and academic institutions. The researchers' instrumentation had detected electromagnetic anomalies in the vicinity of the Holloway farmstead that corresponded to no known natural phenomena, while also recording temperature variations and atmospheric pressure changes that seemed to be related to the sisters' activities and mental states. These measurements had suggested that the sisters were somehow manipulating physical forces that could be detected by scientific instruments, even if the mechanisms involved could not be explained by contemporary theoretical frameworks. Dr. Q. Whitfield's medical examinations of affected community members had revealed consistent physiological changes that included modifications to nervous system function, hormone production, and cellular metabolism that exceeded anything documented in medical literature. These changes appeared to be beneficial rather than pathological, enhancing cognitive function and physical health in ways that represented genuine improvements in human capability. The most significant aspect of Dr. Whitfield's research had been her documentation of apparent consciousness transfer effects that enabled affected individuals to access memories, knowledge, and capabilities that belonged to other people rather than themselves. These effects suggested that the sisters had developed techniques for creating shared consciousness states that transcended normal individual psychological boundaries. The investigation into consciousness transfer phenomena had revealed that the sisters' influence created what Dr. Whitfield termed collective memory pools that enabled affected individuals to draw upon the accumulated knowledge and experience of their entire community, rather than being limited to their own personal learning and development. This shared consciousness appeared to enhance problem-solving capabilities, while also creating psychological dependencies that bound individuals to the collective. Federal investigators from the Treasury Department had arrived in Miller's Hollow in 1898, following reports of unusual economic activities that might involve counterfeiting, tax evasion, or other financial crimes related to the sisters' apparent prosperity and their influence on local economic conditions. The government agents had expected to find evidence of conventional criminal activity, but had instead encountered phenomena that challenged their understanding of economic and social relationships. Agent Theodore Morrison had led the federal investigation, bringing experience in complex fraud cases and sophisticated criminal organizations that he had expected would be applicable to the Holloway sisters' activities. However, his investigation had quickly revealed that the sisters' economic success was based on capabilities that exceeded anything documented in federal law enforcement experience. The economic analysis conducted by Agent Morrison had revealed that the sisters' farmstead produced agricultural yields that were impossible to achieve through conventional farming methods, while their livestock demonstrated health and productivity levels that exceeded biological norms for their species. These extraordinary results had enabled the sisters to generate wealth that far exceeded what should have been possible from their land and resources. More disturbing to the federal investigators had been the discovery that the sisters' economic influence extended throughout the local community in ways that created systematic improvements in prosperity and stability that could not be explained through normal economic mechanisms. Families that had been struggling with poverty and debt had experienced sudden reversals of fortune that enabled them to achieve financial security without apparent sources of new income or economic opportunity. The investigation into these economic anomalies had revealed that the sisters possessed abilities that enabled them to influence material conditions through methods that transcended conventional understanding of cause and effect relationships. Their capabilities appeared to include limited control over natural processes, probability manipulation, and what could only be described as materialization abilities that enabled them to obtain resources through unknown means. Agent Morrison's attempts to gather evidence of criminal activity had been frustrated by the inability of federal law enforcement to classify the sisters' methods according to existing legal frameworks. The improvements in community prosperity that resulted from their influence were clearly beneficial to the affected individuals, making it difficult to characterize their activities as harmful or exploitative, despite their obviously extraordinary nature. The federal investigation had also encountered systematic obstruction from community members who had been affected by the sisters' influence, though this resistance appeared to be motivated by genuine loyalty and gratitude rather than fear or coercion. The affected individuals seemed to view the federal agents as threats to beneficial relationships that they were determined to protect regardless of potential legal consequences. The psychological analysis of this community loyalty had revealed that the sisters had created emotional bonds with their subjects that transcended normal social relationships, establishing themselves as essential figures in the psychological and spiritual lives of the affected individuals. These bonds appeared to operate at unconscious levels that made them extremely resistant to external interference or rational analysis. Dr. Samuel Chen, a physician and researcher specializing in neurological disorders, had joined the investigation in 1899 after reports of the sisters' apparent ability to cure various ailments and disabilities that had been considered incurable by contemporary medical science. His medical background had provided him with expertise in nervous system function that was essential for understanding the biological mechanisms through which the sisters achieved their remarkable healing results. Dr. Chen's medical examinations had documented instances of healing that included the restoration of sight to blind individuals, the regeneration of damaged nervous tissue, and the elimination of chronic diseases that had persisted for years despite conventional medical treatment. These healings had been accomplished through methods that involved direct contact between the sisters and their subjects, though the specific techniques employed remained mysterious to scientific observation. The neurological analysis of healed individuals had revealed systematic changes in brain structure and function that appeared to represent not only restoration of normal capabilities, but actual improvements beyond typical human baselines. The subjects displayed enhanced cognitive abilities, improved sensory function, and increased resistance to physical and psychological stress that suggested they had been upgraded rather than simply repaired. Dr. Chen's research had led him to conclude that the sisters possessed understanding of biological systems that enabled them to direct cellular regeneration and nervous system modification with precision that exceeded anything achievable through conventional medical intervention. Their methods appeared to involve conscious control over biological processes that normal humans could only influence through unconscious autonomic functions. The healing capabilities demonstrated by the sisters had attracted pilgrims and patients from throughout the Midwest region, creating a steady stream of visitors to Miller's Hollow who sought treatment for various ailments and disabilities. This influx of outsiders had transformed the isolated mountain community into a destination that attracted attention from medical professionals, religious authorities, and government officials who were concerned about the implications of such extraordinary healing claims. The religious implications of the sisters' healing activities had created conflicts within various Christian denominations about whether their capabilities should be considered divine gifts or demonic powers. Some religious leaders had endorsed the sisters as instruments of divine healing, while others had condemned them as practitioners of witchcraft or supernatural deception that threatened the spiritual welfare of their followers. Reverend Jonathan Thornton, a Methodist minister who had traveled to Miller's Hollow to investigate the sisters' healing claims, had found himself forced to reconsider fundamental theological assumptions about the nature of divine intervention and human spiritual potential. His observations of genuine healing miracles had challenged his understanding of how God's power operated in the material world. The Reverend's theological investigation had revealed that the sisters' healing methods did not conform to traditional Christian frameworks for understanding divine healing, as they involved techniques and knowledge that appeared to be learned skills rather than spontaneous manifestations of divine grace. This distinction had raised complex questions about the relationship between human capability and divine intervention that challenged conventional religious doctrine. The sisters' own religious beliefs and practices had remained largely mysterious to outside observers, as they had maintained privacy about their spiritual perspectives, while demonstrating respect for various religious traditions without committing themselves to any specific denominational framework. Their approach to spirituality appeared to encompass elements from multiple traditions while transcending the limitations of any single doctrinal system. The investigation into the sisters' religious background had revealed connections to various esoteric and mystical traditions that had preserved knowledge about consciousness manipulation and healing techniques that were unknown to mainstream religious institutions. These connections suggested that the sisters were part of a broader network of individuals who maintained alternative spiritual practices that operated parallel to conventional religious organizations. The winter of 1899-1900 had marked a significant transition in the sisters' activities, as they had begun to implement systematic changes to the social and economic structures of Miller's Hollow that transformed the community into something that more closely resembled a commune or intentional community than a traditional rural settlement. These changes had been introduced gradually and with the apparent consent of the affected residents, though outside observers had questioned whether such consent could be considered genuine given the extent of psychological influence that the sisters wielded. The community reorganization had involved the establishment of collective ownership arrangements for land and resources, coordinated work schedules that maximized efficiency and productivity, and social governance systems that operated through consensus rather than traditional authority structures. These innovations had created a community that was more prosperous, harmonious, and stable than typical frontier settlements, though they had also eliminated many aspects of individual autonomy and privacy that were considered essential to American democratic values. The success of the community transformation had attracted attention from social reformers and utopian thinkers who had viewed Miller's Hollow as a practical demonstration of alternative social organization that addressed many of the problems associated with competitive individualism and unregulated capitalism. However, these positive assessments had been complicated by concerns about the methods used to achieve such remarkable social cooperation. The psychological analysis of the transformed community had revealed that the residents' cooperation and contentment were based on consciousness modifications that had eliminated many aspects of individual identity and personal ambition that were considered fundamental to human nature. The community members had achieved harmony through the systematic suppression of psychological characteristics that created conflict and competition, though this suppression had also eliminated much of what was traditionally considered human creativity and individual expression. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a sociologist from Columbia University, had conducted extensive research into the social dynamics of the transformed Miller's Hollow community during 1900-1901, documenting the mechanisms through which the sisters had achieved such remarkable social cohesion, while also analyzing the implications of their methods for broader questions about human nature and social organization. Professor Sinclair's research had revealed that the community transformation had followed systematic principles that combined advanced understanding of group psychology with practical techniques for consciousness modification that enabled the creation of collective identity while maintaining sufficient individual autonomy to preserve motivation and creativity. The sisters had achieved a delicate balance that maximized social cooperation without completely eliminating personal initiative. The sociological analysis had also revealed that the transformed community operated according to economic principles that transcended normal market relationships, with resource allocation determined by need rather than ability to pay, and work assignments based on capability and interest rather than economic competition. These innovations had created unprecedented prosperity and stability, while also eliminating many of the social problems associated with poverty and inequality. However, Professor Sinclair's research had also identified potential long-term consequences of the community transformation that raised concerns about sustainability and adaptability. The residents' dependence on the sisters' continued guidance and their reduced capacity for independent decision-making suggested that the community might be vulnerable to collapse if the sisters were removed, or if external circumstances required adaptations that exceeded their modified capabilities. The investigation into the broader implications of the sisters' community transformation had revealed connections to various social reform movements and utopian experiments that had been attempting to create alternative forms of social organization throughout the late 19th century. The sisters appeared to have achieved practical success in areas where other reformers had encountered insurmountable obstacles, though their methods raised ethical questions about the acceptability of consciousness modification as a tool for social change. The spring of 1901 had brought the arrival of international researchers and investigators who had been attracted by reports of the extraordinary phenomena associated with Miller's Hollow. These foreign observers had included representatives from European scientific institutions, religious organizations, and government agencies who were interested in understanding and possibly replicating the sisters' achievements in their own countries. Professor Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna had led a comprehensive European investigation into the sisters' capabilities, bringing advanced theoretical frameworks from German psychology and philosophy that had provided new perspectives on consciousness manipulation and social transformation. His research had contributed to growing international recognition that the Miller's Hollow phenomena represented developments of global significance rather than isolated American curiosities. The international attention had created new pressures and opportunities for the sisters, who had been invited to demonstrate their capabilities in various foreign locations, while also facing increased scrutiny from government agencies that were concerned about the potential for their methods to be used for subversive or destabilizing purposes. The sisters had declined most invitations to travel, preferring to maintain their operations in the familiar environment of Miller's Hollow. The decision to remain in their original location had been interpreted by some observers as evidence that the sisters' capabilities were dependent on specific environmental factors or energy sources that were unique to the Missouri Ozarks region. However, subsequent research had revealed that their choice to stay was more likely motivated by strategic considerations related to maintaining control over their transformed community and avoiding exposure to external influences that might disrupt their carefully developed social system. The summer of 1901 had witnessed the implementation of the sisters' most ambitious project, the establishment of an educational institution that would train selected individuals in the consciousness manipulation techniques that formed the foundation of their community transformation methods. This school had attracted students from throughout North America and Europe who sought to learn skills that could enable them to create similar communities in their own regions. The curriculum developed by the sisters had covered topics that ranged from basic meditation and consciousness development to advanced techniques for influencing group psychology and social dynamics. The instruction methods had employed accelerated learning approaches that enabled students to acquire complex skills in timeframes that were impossible through conventional educational methods, though the training had also involved psychological modifications that created permanent changes in the students' consciousness and capabilities. The graduates of the sisters' educational program had been dispersed to various locations throughout North America and Europe, where they had established communities that followed similar principles while adapting to local conditions and cultural contexts. These satellite communities had maintained communication and coordination with Miller's Hollow, while developing their own innovations and adaptations that contributed to the overall evolution of the consciousness-based social organization movement. The establishment of the broader network of consciousness-based communities had represented the culmination of the sisters' long-term strategy for spreading their methods and creating a parallel civilization that operated according to principles of cooperation and collective consciousness rather than competition and individual aggrandizement. This network had grown throughout the early 20th century while maintaining careful secrecy about its ultimate objectives and capabilities. The modern analysis of the Holloway sisters phenomenon has benefited from advances in psychology, neuroscience, and social science that have provided theoretical frameworks for understanding consciousness manipulation and social influence techniques that were incomprehensible to 19th century investigators. Contemporary researchers have identified similarities between the sisters' methods and various therapeutic, educational, and social intervention techniques that have been developed through legitimate scientific research. However, the sophistication and effectiveness of the sisters' original methods continue to exceed what contemporary science considers achievable through known techniques, suggesting that they possessed understanding of consciousness and social dynamics that remains unknown to mainstream academic institutions. Their achievements continue to serve as challenges to conventional assumptions about the limits of human potential and the possibilities for consciously directed social evolution. The historical impact of the Holloway sisters and their Harvest Supper extends far beyond the specific events that occurred in Miller's Hollow to encompass broader questions about human consciousness, social organization, and the potential for guided evolution that remain relevant to contemporary discussions about personal development, community building, and social transformation. Their story serves as both inspiration and warning about the possibilities and dangers of transcending conventional limitations on human capability and social cooperation. In the timeless mystery of human potential and social possibility, where the boundaries between individual consciousness and collective purpose remain as fluid as the morning mists that still shroud the hills of Miller's Hollow, the legacy of the Holloway sisters continues to challenge our understanding of what human beings might become when freed from the limitations of conventional thinking and social organization, leaving us to wonder whether the extraordinary capabilities they demonstrated represent forgotten aspects of human potential that await rediscovery, or whether they were pioneers of evolutionary developments that have yet to reach their full flowering in the broader human community, and whether the transformation they initiated in one small mountain community might serve as a prototype for changes that could eventually encompass all of human civilization.